did you do that?
It's ready.
Almost ready? Okay.
Okay.
Yep, we're going to count. 10, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Now? Okay, hi. My name is Ursula Millas. I was born February 27, 1918 in Berlin, Germany. And I grew up, my father came to Berlin in 1902 from Romania and loved it because it was free and no anti-Semitism. And he was just completely, it was like the promised land to him. My mother was German, Christian, Lutheran, and after going with each other for 8 years because my grandparents violently disapproved, they got married, and my mother converted to Judaism. And I grew up not thinking that there was too much of a difference. There was no problem between Jews and Christians. And I had quite a happy childhood up to a point. When I was 15, Hitler entered the picture, and we had heard about him before here and there. Nobody took him seriously. And this was 1933, and when he came to power, my father said 100 days. And of course, unfortunately, he was wrong. My impressions of Nazism started at school, besides all the gatherings and the shouting and that you heard on the streets, and of course over the radio. It started at school because slowly we were about 50-50 Jews and Gentiles in my class, girls only. And after the first laws were introduced that Jewish girls, it started that they had to sit in a separate wing. I mean, the Jewish girls on the left and the Gentile girls on the right-hand side. So that was number one. And then they came up, and it was talked about that the Jewish girls had to leave school, with the exception of mixed marriages, war veterans, they could stay, and foreign people with foreign passports. Now, I was okay. I counted on 2 counts. I was from a mixed marriage, and my father kept his Romanian citizenship by a quirk of fate that proved very fortunate later on. It bothered me enormously that a lot of my friends had to leave school, and I was very upset, and I came home and I said I didn't want to stay in the school either. My parents didn't like it. They wanted me to have an education, and I was in the gymnasium, which is headed towards the baccalaureate, and which goes straight on to college. Well, I managed to stay. My parents managed to keep me staying at school until I was 16, and then I just didn't want to stay because most of my friends had to leave, and so I got out of school and had some private instruction.
How did they explain to you the splitting of the school? How did your parents explain that to you at 15, that your friends were going to be?
We knew about Hitler's ideology and what he had planned, and there was not much of an explanation. Everybody was so puzzled about and shocked about there were new laws coming out every day. There was a very well-organized propaganda on radio, where they had taken, for instance, sayings from the Talmud and interpreted them. I mean, you can interpret things any old way if you try, and had interpreted it, of course, to the detriment of the Jewish faith and people. It was, you just sort of, you were half numbed and half in disbelief and somewhat shocked. It was something that people couldn't cope very well with, because it was a great disbelief. My father just couldn't believe that his Germany, that he was so happy and embraced with such fervor, could develop into what it was developing into. So there was, I don't know, the feelings were so mixed that it's very hard to explain. I mean, you go through each day and you think to yourself, it couldn't be true. It just couldn't be happening. It's not, that must be a bad dream. And of course, the bad dream got worse. The first years were not as bad yet. I mean, there was a lot of talk. There was a propaganda that was prepared very carefully. There were all these mass meetings and marches and the pomp and the things that the German people like. They like a leader with charisma. They like somebody that gives them decorations, uniforms, music, speeches, and the economy, of course, in Germany was very bad. And it probably would have, it was sort of a way, it either could have turned towards communism, and the other alternative was the Nazis. So that was the first year we saw. In fact, I saw Hitler and I saw Goebbels, who was also, I mean, a devil in human form. I saw them in the car passing by, and we always thought it couldn't last. And the first big shock, probably, well, before that, my life went on, except that we had entertainment, all that, but it was more segregated.
This is after 1933.
That's after 1933. It was segregated. You didn't have, I mean, you could not go from month to month. It was more restricted where you could go. There were a lot of restaurants where there were signs that Jews are not Juden unerwünscht, which means Jews are not undesired. And for instance, a ball was, of course, absolutely against. I mean, no Jew could attend a ball. They had opera balls and all kind of lovely things, because Berlin had been a fantastic city to live in up to that, culturally, artistically, in every respect. And so we had our own entertainment, or which was restricted to Jews, and that was something also very difficult to get used to if you grew up sort of in both worlds. And that's the way it went on, and it sort of, I was a teenager, and teenagers are very impressionable, and it really did a lot to me. It bothered me a lot, it hurt me a lot. When my parents went out, when I went out with my parents, my mother was blonde and blue-eyed, my father was very dark-haired, so it was very obvious that they were probably a mixed marriage. In fact, I remember that my mother got a letter from some government department. If she would divorce that they had checked her papers, if she would divorce my father, they could reinstate her full Aryan origin, and nothing would impair that. Of course, she threw it away, but that was indicative of how far they go.
Was there a response by the Jewish community to these rules that were laws that were coming out every day? Was there any sort of unified response?
There were, let's say, the young people pretty much realized that they wanted, that the best thing was to get out. A lot of people left in 33, 34. More and more, those were, I don't know, the ones with a real far view, and as I remember it, most of the young people wanted out, and the parents were hesitant because they thought it was going to change. Of course, they had many years of good life behind them, and a lot of them. Now, I met my first husband when I was not quite 18, so that was 3 years, like 36. He was from a family, a Jewish family, that had lived in Germany for centuries, and his parents had no intention of leaving because, like I said, everybody was convinced it wasn't going to last. Now he was, like all the young people, he said, out, we have to get out, and so he left in 1937, and he came to the United States. The first big shock, the big shock wave was the Kristallnacht. That was in 38. That was a big shock. That was the first kind of rippling of what was going to come later. Until that time, it was, except for talk and, like I said, propaganda, it was not all that, it wasn't gruesome yet. I know that after the Kristallnacht, we had about, since my father had a foreign passport, we had about 16 people sleep at our house for several nights. Because what would happen is that during the night, they would come and make raids. Not much during the day, but always at night. So also my future parents-in-law stayed at our house, and it was a very that was the first big scare. It was a very scary thing, and that's really when we, like I said, that was a shockwave. My first future husband had left already, and what we had thought about or planned is that he left in 1937, that probably in 2 years I could follow when he would be ready to get married and all that. Well, after the Kristallnacht, it became obvious he had to get his parents out first. So, and then my father realized that maybe we should leave too. My father had been in the export business. He had German firms first, and then he switched to English firms that he represented, and he sold merchandise in Scandinavia and in the Balkans. So he had a come and go, a free visa to England. He could travel. So by the time 39 in spring, he was ready and convinced that one should leave. I had been pushing for years, but...
How did he respond when you would push?
Hesitant. He would listen to me and say, well, but I'd still think that things will change. And but then more and more people left, and so he became more responsive. He was never saying to me, maybe at the very beginning he said, oh, I don't think anything that bad is going to happen. That was only at the very beginning. As years went on, he was listening and just wouldn't say I'm foolish, but he was hesitant. He couldn't bring himself to pull up roots and leave.
What was he hanging on to?
Well, let's say Germany had been his dream, fulfilled dream. Like when we came to the United States, that was about the same thing. And he loved it very much. He had very good years there, and he became successful. And he had also prepared, his retirement, my dowry, everything was prepared, everything was assured, secured. So to go out and pull up stakes and go into the nowhere, today I can understand it. Then I couldn't, because young people don't think about the things, the possessions and the things that we cling to when we get older, when we have accumulated. And so that's probably what... My mother never fought in any way. If he was going to go, she was going to go. There was no question in her mind.
Did he equate leaving with submission? With giving up? Well,
probably, yeah. Giving up a dream, an ideal that was... It didn't dawn on me then that it could be anything like that. I just thought he was slow and pokey and couldn't make up his mind or couldn't... I said, possession, so what? But he had worked for it and everything. When you prepare for your retirement, your old age, I was an only child, your daughter, it's just giving up practically your whole life that you had worked for. And he was by then in his 50s. He was born in 1880, so he was in his 50s, and it's probably very difficult. Today that I'm older, I can see it. Then I couldn't. So anyway, we were preparing then to, my future parents-in-law were waiting for their emigration, and we were preparing. And my mother had not too much contact with her family. Because unfortunately some of them, she came from a very large family, some of them obviously were Nazis, and she wouldn't have anything to do with them. There was one niece of hers, it was almost her age, and they grew up like sisters, who she was very close to, and she was like my second mother. It was Aunt Lucy, who her husband was a teacher, and he never was a Nazi, but he had to belong to the party, otherwise he wouldn't have had a job. And she came to see us, but it was more and more difficult for her, because had anybody caught her, her husband would have lost his job. And we saw her up to the very end, so we were preparing to leave, and we had to make all kind of petitions to get our furniture out, and this, and it took quite a while. And we were ready like about in April of '39. And then we were not quite ready yet. We were waiting for a petition to be granted to take our jewelry. And that took quite a long time. The German Jews were not permitted to take anything like that. So we had also my future parents-in-law jewelry in a little package. And so we were waiting for that. My father had sent some money to England through a courier, illegally, of course. Unfortunately, I don't know, not on the first, on the 8th or 9th trip, that courier got caught. And when my father heard that, he knew that he had to leave. So in May of 1939, my father, we were sitting down, and we decided that we had to close the van with all the furniture. And we just dropped the package with the jewelry in when we thought nobody saw it. And my father, we were discussing that my father was going to leave one day. My mother was going to follow a few days later. Some relatives had gotten her a job like a cook in England. So, I mean, that way she had a visa. And they had applied for me as a nursemaid, but mine hadn't come through. So we decided, I was a very independent kid, and I was by now 21. My mother was much more the old-fashioned type that was sort of whatever her husband said she did. So she wouldn't have been much of a help. She was also very scared. I wasn't scared of anything. And so we decided, the three of us, that my mother should follow my father, and I would stay back. I stayed in a pension, that's sort of like a small hotel. And I had my future parents-in-law, and they were still waiting. So my parents left in May of 1939. And I stayed back alone in Berlin, which was fine with me. I felt my oats. I was independent. I was alone. It was actually not all that bad. My visa was supposed to come through the middle of September. So in the end, it was the 27th of August, the 26th to be exact, that my father called me from London. Very firm, you have to go and visit Aunt Emily. Now, Aunt Emily was a sister in Bucharest, Romania. What we had prepared is I had my passport ready with a Polish transit visa in it. And of course, so if anything would come up, I could leave immediately. I, being the arguing type, said to my father, why? And I have to do this. And he said, don't contradict me. You and Emily needs you. You leave tonight or tomorrow. That was in the evening. And I said, well, I don't know whether I can get ready. You can get ready. Then I think it dawned on me there must be something very pressing. We knew nothing of any kind of preparation for war. Now, this was just about a few days before the war officially broke out. Well, I managed to leave the next day. And it so happened that was the last train that went through Poland. I was probably the only female on the train. We were told not to have the shutters down, not to look out. Of course, I looked out anyway, naturally. I saw all along the road, all along the way, troop movements. This train went through Poland, so they were on the move, and I saw long throngs of refugees. And when I got to Bucharest after a day and a night, it took that long, the whole family was at the railroad station, and they were all crying that I had made it. And then I realized there was no more train that went out. Then I realized that how I had escaped. So I stayed in Bucharest with my relatives, and my father, being an only child, my parents were both in England, and they wanted very much that the child should be with them.
May I ask you one question?
Yeah.
How did your father, did he have any information? What made it so?
Oh, he knew in England, he knew that it was a very dangerous situation, and that because in England the information was open and free, and in Germany you didn't know what was going on. It was just like a totalitarian state. He knew that the Germans had already pushed into Poland, and so he just didn't want for me to take any further chance to get stuck, and I would have been stuck. I certainly would have been stuck there. So he knew, and I couldn't believe. I didn't really know what he was so panicky about. I could hear the urgency in his voice.
Why did he not say anything to you on the phone?
Oh, he couldn't, because it was all. I mean, you overheard, I'm sure. I mean, you didn't dare to say anything on the phone anyway, even if you would talk to friends, because you never knew which phones were bugged, and surely it would be overheard if somebody calls from England to Berlin. I mean, most certainly somebody was on the line and listened in. So he didn't, that's why he didn't mention any particulars, just Aunt Emily. Well, I know where Aunt Emily is. So he didn't say go to Romania. No, he said you have to go visit Aunt Emily. And I, knowing where Aunt Emily was, knew that he meant I have to leave for Romania.
So you knew you shouldn't say Romania on the phone?
Oh, I didn't, no, yes. That much I knew. That much I knew. So the war was still sort of quiet for the first half year. And except they took over Poland and I think Czechoslovakia. And my father, his firms wanted him to make a trip to sell, and he grabbed the opportunity because he wanted to go to the Balkans. He thought if he comes to Romania, he could free me and take me to England. Well, he made it to Romania, and I was very happy to see him. But the moment he arrived in Romania, Italy entered the war. So he had come via Italy. And that means that his return was not possible. The British offered him that he could go by boat via South Africa or something like that, but he couldn't take me because by the time I was 21, I was in my country. I had a Romanian passport, so he didn't want to leave me. So we stayed. Again, he thought the war wasn't going to last long, so we stayed both in Bucharest. And Bucharest was neutral for the first, Romania was neutral for the first 2 years. And life went almost on as usual because it was pretty nice. And I didn't worry too much, except that I would have liked to be together with my mother, but still thinking it couldn't last all that long. In the meantime, I had my future, my husband-to-be, had sent me some affidavits that his parents managed to leave before I left in August. And I took them to the railroad station, and they were very sad, and I wished them well. And I remember his father said that, I don't know, old trees cannot be uprooted that easily. And his father died in England, just very suddenly of a heart attack. His mother made it to the United States. And then in 1940, I think, just before the traffic they stopped across the Atlantic. So he had sent me, now that he had his mother over, he sent me the affidavits, and I received them in fall of 1941. And they were at the American consulate, and I was supposed to go for an interview in December. Well, December 6th, Pearl Harbor happened, so that was the end of that. And so Romania entered the war, and we had, at first, the Germans came through on their way to Russia, and they were very busy getting through they didn't have too much time to bother with the Jews yet, because they needed Romania's oil and wheat. And the Romanians, although being very anti-Semitic, also like to take bakshish, if you know what that means. And the Jews at the beginning could buy themselves free. So they wouldn't buy, besides they're not that organized. So they were just sort of doing haphazard things, but nothing really organized. At one time, there was, while the Germans were in Russia, and Bessarabia was sometimes Romanian, sometimes Russian, there was a list, it was publicized that people could write their names on a list if they wanted to immigrate to Bessarabia. And a lot of Jews went for that because they wanted to get out before the Germans would come back. And some in my family, my father had a very large family in Romania, wanted to do it too. And my father said, no way, you don't put your name on any document. So none of our family did. What happened later is that the people that had put their name on these lists, they were arrested and taken to concentration camps. And maybe just a few made it to Bessarabia. But then later on they rounded up the ones in Bessarabia too, when the Germans returned. So there were you didn't know what was going to happen tomorrow. You lived just for today. And we had sort of thought, we lived in a little apartment near a park, my father and I. And he was a very wise and smart man, and he said, we have to think of something if they come at night to pick us up for some reason. They would go through certain streets and then quit. So next to us was a Catholic, like a diocese that was connected with Rome directly, and they my father went there and asked them in case of anything should happen and they should come and pick us up, want to pick us up, could we find refuge with you? And they said yes. So where we lived, we would have to walk up another, it was just a two-story house. We would go on the roof, and there was a big tree, and my father said, this tree, if we hear anybody come into the house, we're going to run up here, get on the tree, go down and run to the Catholic diocese, and they're going to give us shelter. So this was a little bit comforting to know that there was a chance. Well, thanks heaven we never had to do that because they never came into our street. There was a street next to us, but our street they did not canvass.
Did you sleep well through the night?
Well, I did. I don't think my father did so well.
Why do you think you slept well through the night?
When you are young, you always, and I'm an optimist anyway, I always thought that it's going to end well. I'm going to get out of it. Nothing is going to happen. Or somehow, I did not. When you haven't had many bad experiences yet, real bad, and when you're young, you just sort of, if you're an optimist, I just thought we come through. And then, of course, the air raid started. That started in 43, I believe, 44, 43. And the Allied air raids, they came from the southern part of Italy. And we had a lot of, they were actually aiming to bomb the oil fields near Bucharest, which is called Ploiești. And I forgot one important thing that had repercussions later. When I came to Romania from Germany, right at the beginning, I went to the British embassy or mission, British embassy, and I offered myself as a spy. I said that I escaped from Germany and I would love to be a spy. Of course, I had no experience or anything. They looked at me and they took all my name and address and every information down, and they said, I remember it was a Colonel Candle, I'll never forget the name. And he said, well, I mean, we appreciate your offer. If we have any need, we will think of you, but you have no experience, so it's not very likely that we will need you soon or if ever. But anyway, we appreciate it, and I felt disappointed because I would have loved to be a spy, do anything to get back at the Germans somehow.
What stimulated that? Was there any event in particular that made you go there that day, or?
No, I mean, I knew where that was a place to go. Nothing in particular. I was just, I wanted to, it's like volunteering for the war. That's probably what it was. I wanted to do my part or my share, whatever I could, to help the war effort so that the Germans would lose. That probably stimulated the whole thing.
So it wasn't enough for you that you were safe?
No, I wanted to help. That was the idea.
What did you spend your day doing during all this time?
During all this time, I had a job at first. I had a secretarial job. I mean, I was living with my father, so we were keeping house. that was one. I had a secretarial job until with a Jewish, very small firm, until he had to give up his, when after 41 and the Holy War for Romania started, and he had to give up his business. And then, believe it or not, I was teaching English. I had learned English at the Berlitz School in private lessons, and I knew the grammar well, and I could manage some conversation. And there were no English teachers or Americans around because they all had left. The Romanians really never cared much for the Germans. They are much more Francophiles. And everybody knew French. I knew French too, but German hardly. I would have taught German, but nobody was interested. But people were interested in learning English. So I made a living teaching English. How I had the nerve, looking back today, it's amazing, but I did okay. And my father did all kind of business, cotton, and it was a very lean, tough time. And I had been rather spoiled, and it was probably good for me to see the value of money and to see what it means not to have any. It was very tough. We had our family to help, and things went real bad, but my father was very proud, so he did not ask for help very often. And so it was a tough time, but of a lot of things that I couldn't afford and I couldn't have, and even food, we had to think very carefully about food, what to spend and what to buy. But I always thought that's just temporary. It's bound to get better. And then slowly the Germans did poorly, did more poorly. Well, we had the air raids, and the air raids were very scary. They came also at night, and we were in that small building where we were. We had an apartment, but it was a small building. One night it was bombed, and we were in a shelter, and we thought this was the end, because that was much at the end. I'm not quite there yet. So we had the air raids of the Allied forces, and we had to run to shelters. And the feeling was very strange, because you are really like the guys that bomb you, but you still have to hide because you don't really want to be hit. So then it came that the Germans were on the retreat, and they had to retreat from Russia through Romania towards Hungary. By 1944, fall of 1944, Romania had declared an armistice. They saw that where the losing end was, and they had made an armistice with the Allied forces. And the Germans were furious about it, because they were still in Russia coming back. So the worst bombings happened when the Germans were stationed outside of Bucharest for 3 days and 3 nights, and they sent their Stuka planes over Bucharest, like about every hour on the hour. One plane with 10 bombs, and you could count it. And when you would hear it, then you knew you were safe. And we were in the shelter. Now that's where I said, of that little building where we lived, and the 10th bomb we didn't hear, and it hit that shelter on one side. And my father and I embraced each other. We thought that was it. But then he pushed towards the other door on the other end, and the door opened miraculously. We ran out, and there was that same Stuka, and they dived down and started machine gunning. and we threw ourselves on the floor, on the ground, and we were not hit. Lucky. My cousin, who was with us at the time, found a shell very nearby. So it was just sheer luck, that we escaped. And this was a terrible 3 days and 3 nights because there was a continuous bombing. And we finally went over, since our building was damaged, we ran over to my aunt who didn't live far away. And we hid in her basement, and it seemed like it was never ending. And I mean, you couldn't bathe, you couldn't do anything, you just sat there. And well, then it finally was over. They left and they went towards Hungary. And we came out, and we were hoping that the Allied forces were going to liberate us. But that was not meant to be. We got the Russians. And they came, it probably still was 1944. And they came, and the armies the liberating armies that we got were not the Russians that you sort of imagine, but it was more the Mongolian, from the Mongolian parts of Russia. And they had been through a horrible war, and they were very wild and uncivilized and threatening, really. And they would rape women wherever they could, and then they had a passion for watches. I don't know why, but it was, you wouldn't wear a watch anymore because you could see, when they saw somebody with a watch, it was immediately "Давай час," which means "give me your watch." And you could see some Russians with about 7 watches on their wrist. And they would drink vodka at night and shoot guns, and you could hear that. After dark, nobody would, especially women, wouldn't be on the street. And we were glad to be rid of the Germans, but the Russians were not such a blessing either. So finally, that was over. And
during that time, what precautions did you take, or did your father take? How did you live, especially being a 21-year-old?
Well, of course, I was a few years older by then, Well, you just live as best you can, I mean, we had, after the Germans were through with their bombing, I remember that we were 3 months where we lived. It was repaired, sort of. 3 months we were without sewer, water and electricity. So we were lucky we were near that park, so we went every evening with 3 buckets and got water. There was a fresh little stream, and we got the water, and you were washing yourself and dishes and using it for sewage, so I mean plumbing, and it's amazing how you can make do that way. In fact, I was in Bucharest a few years ago with my daughter, and I found the spot in the park. I showed her the house where we had lived. I found the spot in the park where we had gotten the water from. And she was just, I mean, it made a big impression on her. So life was pretty hard, but you sort of scrounged through.
Was it safe to walk around the street from the Russians?
During the day wasn't so bad. At night you wouldn't take too much of a chance. They were not killing, but they would rape women, and especially when they got drunk, it was bad. Then they would just go wild. And they would requisition homes, and they didn't know. They would make a fire on the floor and cook that way. They didn't know stoves. I mean, they were just real primitive, from a very primitive part of Russia. So if you were unlucky enough to lose your home or house to the requisitioning, was pretty much very heavily damaged. But they were not going around killing. After all, they were our liberators. But one interesting thing happened, that I got a call from the British military mission. And they gave me a job. There were 5 British colonels and 1 American to come and work as a translator. It was quite secretive, and what my job was to translate from Romanian into English what damage the bombings had done in the oil fields of Ploiești. And that probably goes back to my offering myself as a spy. And I had this job for about a year, and I was extremely pleased, very happy, being picked up with a limousine with the British flag and the American flag on top of it every day. So that was a big bonus for me, and I really thrived on that. And also then there were quite a few Americans that had been taken prisoners from the air raids. They were shot down. And before the war even was over, my cousins and I would go past the buildings where we knew they were kept, and we would whistle the Yankee Doodle Dandy, thinking that that was the American national anthem. And we would look up to the windows and make the V sign to them, so that they knew that we were sympathizers. And then after the armistice, and when they were free, we would invite these guys to the house and to parties and try to do everything we could for them. And they were quite happy until they were shipped home. So then things were getting better, and it was now when the war was over, when it was declared that in 1944, and when was it? June, I believe, that the war was over in Europe. We were dancing on the street. I mean, we were just so happy and relieved. I mean, still was not good. It was bad, but it was over. And I went, actually, in August, I went on a mountain climbing tour with my cousins and some friends. And when we came down, we heard that Japan had capitulated, and it was really over. So then, of course, I had heard all through the year, through the war, we had communicated with my mother through the Red Cross, 25 words. We knew she was there. She had a very tough time in England, in London. And my fiancé also, I mean, I was in touch with him through the Red Cross. And it was 45, when I got a letter from him that he wanted to send me the affidavits. And I was overjoyed, and it took me until August, this was New Year, 44, 45. No, 45, 46. Yeah, 45, 46. And it took me until August 46 to get my exit visa from Romania, to leave the country, never to return, and to lose the citizenship. Then there was no consulate in Bucharest or anywhere in Romania. The next was Czechoslovakia and Prague. So I obtained a transit visa for Czechoslovakia. And it was a tremendous job to get all the papers together, and finally, before leaving, well, I managed to leave on August 17th of 1946 and to get to Prague. It was the day of the expiration of the transit visa, and I'm surprised how I made it through the Romanian border, because they saw that I could leave and that the Czechs let me in. That was probably a miracle. I had nothing but a transit visa to Czechoslovakia and my affidavits. Well,
where was your father?
My father was still in Bucharest and my mother was in London. So it was a very sad farewell, but he was, a great part of the family thought that a girl alone, even though I was, 28 by now, it was much too dangerous to leave into the world without knowing exactly where you're going, except ultimate destination is America. But my father and one aunt and one cousin, they were very much in favor of it because they thought that was the only way to get out. And my father knew that his daughter was quite a daredevil and probably would make it. So I remember I arrived in Prague and I had no money. I had some money, but it was hidden in a compact behind the mirror because I was only permitted to take $10 with me. And I had some cigarettes, so with the cigarettes, good valuta, I paid my way to take a taxi to go to a hotel that I remembered my parents had stayed at. And I got to the hotel, I called the Hayas, the Jewish organization, and I said, here I am, my visa expires tonight, and I have the affidavits. What am I going to do? They said, don't worry, we'll straighten everything out. You just come here in the morning, and don't worry. So my fiancé was sending me $100 a month. That was enough to live on. And I had a little bit money, just a few $100 in the that big compact behind the mirror. And I didn't know how long it was going to take for me to live in Czechoslovakia. I couldn't get a working permit. There was no way. So it could be, nobody had any idea how long it was going to take. But I felt I was safe already. So I met, just by chance, met some friends that they recognized me from a photograph on the street, and they took me under their wings and they helped me very much. And so then eventually I went to a cheaper hotel, and then I rented a room, and then it was a very exhilarating time while I was in Prague, because all the people that they had survived, they came. Prague was still, it was still the Banish time, and it was before it had become communist in any way, or got behind the Iron Curtain. So it was quite a free life there, and a good life after the war compared to what it had been before. And people from all over came together looking for who had survived. People from the concentration camps, people that had worked underground. And I met a lot of people. I met some from Hungary, some from Poland, some from Czechoslovakia. They told all their stories, how they had survived, how they had escaped. And it was a big exchange, and were some horrible stories, but surviving alone was such a blessing that we all were picking up pieces and starting for the first time after all these years making plans for the future. We had not been able to make any plans for the future since probably '39.
Were you surprised at hearing what you heard about the concentration camps, or did you have some idea as to...
While in Romania, we heard, of course, all kind of stories that at first we thought were stories, but slowly we realized that that was a truth. And it was very frightening, half unbelieving. When I really came to believe it all fully was in Prague, because that's when we met with I met with a lot of people that had some incredible stories to tell. And that is when we could make plans for the future, but we also realized what had happened. And it was very overwhelming. But still, the full extent of what really had happened came later, after the war, after the documentation. We knew bad things were going on. Well, we knew it. But slowly it came through. And I was, again, lucky. It took only 3 months, and I got my American immigration visa.
Was there a difference between the Jewish people who had escaped and weren't a part of the concentration camps in terms of groupings of people? Or?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there was a great solidarity of helping who had survived and getting together and it was like brother meets brother, and you're so happy that here somebody survived and there somebody survived, and this one fought it through. And of course, everyone that I met had lost members of the family. Everyone, and in horrible ways at times. I mean, there were, I know this one, the friends that I had in Prague, the man's family, his father died of natural causes, but he had brothers and they were killed before his eyes. And I mean, some things were so awful that the people couldn't even talk about it. And after I came to the United States, it was the first years I could not talk about it either. It just took a while, and I would get very agitated when something would be on television or something was published about it. I would especially see it on television or in the movies. That was very, very. And when I heard the sirens, in the first couple of years, I heard a siren. We lived close to Parkland, the first apartment we lived in was close to Parkland, and I would jump up in the middle of the night hearing the siren, ready to run to the shelter. And it would really shake me very badly. But even today, today I'm pretty much over it, I would say. I don't like the sound of it, but I guess nobody else does. But when I finally got, when I got my American immigration visa, I was extremely lucky, really, all the way through, because I was in the German quota, being born in Berlin, And the Germans, nobody would let in, and the Jews had been killed, so there was not much of a waiting list. So it didn't take that long. It took only 3 months. Then with a lot of persuasion, I got, trying to persuade the officials to let me get a transit visa to England. I wanted to see my mother, see what's with her. I managed to get to England. I was 3 months in London helping my mother. My mother said she wouldn't care where to be, except she didn't want to be alone anymore. So since my father couldn't come to England because they didn't have any use for any more foreigners, they had their hands full, my mother went to Romania to join my father. And it was not yet communist. I mean, it was just sort of a transit period. And then I came to the United States in February 5, 1947. And I hadn't seen my husband-to-be for 10 years, just about. And, we got married. I mean, it was really, for 3 days we were talking continuously, seeing whether we could take the gamble, because it's a gamble, 10 years, a long time. And we decided we could.
Where was your reunion with him?
In New York.
In New York?
In New York. He came to I arrived, I couldn't get a passage on a ship because it would have taken much longer. So I came on the Pan American Clipper. And landing in Gander and in Shannon and Gander and finally making it over Boston. And I was so excited and so nervous, but when I saw him through the glass door, I knew things were going to be okay. And he said the expression on my face was like a ship sailing into a safe harbor. So, and then he was already settled in Dallas, and his mother had died in the meantime. And so I came to live in Dallas in 1947. 40 wonderful years. Well, there were a lot of heartache in between. He died after 13 years of being married. He died in a heart attack. And I had 2 kids, and then 2 years later I met my present husband, and we were married after another 2 years. And he had 1 boy that is mine too, because I raised him since he was 13. And there we are. So that's the story. Great luck, actually. A lot.
There's been a lot written about, not a lot written. There's been a small amount written about people who had to flee their hometowns and cities in order to escape the Nazis. And what's been written says that that was a tremendously difficult, painful thing to have to do. And in some ways, closely parallels as far as the extent of difficulty and trauma what actually happened to people in concentration camps.
Yeah.
Is that true for you?
When I left Berlin and on the train, then it didn't leave much room for any kind of emotions, because other than everything was so emotional, there was so much going on that you sort of get used to that high pitch of emotion. When I when I came to America, after the war, I had a tremendous hatred in me, tremendous hatred. I didn't want to, and I didn't tell people I was born in Germany. Where are you from? I said Romania. I never taught my children German. My first husband said when we were getting married, he had been here for 10 years already, we're not going to speak German at home, which was fine with me. And so the children, I never made a claim for restitution because, I mean, I could have, but I didn't want their dirty money. And I went back to Germany the first time, I think it was in 63 or something. It was 62, I don't remember exactly. It was a real shock. It was very emotional, very tumultuous inside of me. And it was something that I didn't even want to acknowledge, I didn't want to accept. Over the years, I've been back several times. I found that one aunt that I loved, Aunt Lucy, and she finally managed to come. She was caught up in East Germany, and she managed to come to Berlin. And she was a wonderful person. So as long as she lived, I went back to see her every year. And she had some horrible experiences, also the war too, with the Russians. And I mean, also not being a Nazi, I mean, she had to hide it. Her husband was taken by her husband, who was not a Nazi, except that he had to belong to the party, but he was basically innocent. The Russians had taken away, and she never heard from him anymore. And another cousin of both of ours that we knew had been a Nazi was, in the meantime, the principal of a school. So it's unfair, you know. So anyway, over the years, it has become easier or different. So today, I would never, I mean, they could give me a mountain of gold. I would never want to live in Germany, or not really in Europe at all anymore. When I go back, it's like memories from another life, some familiar things, some things that remind me of my childhood when I was happy there. But basically, I look at it with American eyes.
It seems as though you've had two lives.
Yeah, that's right. I'm a foreigner, and the strange thing is also that people, even though I speak German without a foreign accent, naturally, but they do spot me as an American for some reason or other, and that's fine with me. So it's, in fact, like I mentioned before, I was invited together with my husband, to come to Berlin for a week. That's sort of part of their trying to make up by the mayor of Berlin, and we're going in December. They pay for the hotel and all that, so that's, but I mean, I notice that today a lot of the young people in Germany, or also older, a lot of people want to make up for what happened. And a lot of them, I have some school friends I still see regularly, and they feel that our feelings of hatred and rejection is perfectly justified. They do not feel offended by it. They feel maybe saddened, but they accept it as that's the way it's bound to be. Not all, of course, not all. I'm sure there's some that say that one should forget. Well, one shouldn't forget, because it should never happen again.
Have you visited any of the concentration camps?
No, I have not had the nerve. I have not had the nerve. My children very much want to, and they don't go that often to Europe, but next time any of them goes, they will. No, I haven't. We were in Munich, and my husband Val went to Dachau, and I said I couldn't. I saw, of course, exhibits, and I heard too many, and I knew too many people that had been in Auschwitz, especially. I have not had the strength. I mean, I know all about it. I know what happened. I know what they did. I have one school friend in Germany, and her mother was Jewish, her father was Gentile. Her mother was killed in a concentration camp. And friends, a lot of friends. And I myself have not had, I don't think I could take it. It's very upsetting. And I feel, if you know, I'll never forget. And if I know what happened, the people that don't know exactly what happened, they should see it. But for me, it's too much.
Has your faith changed over the years as a result of the Holocaust?
Well, like I said, I grew up practically with both religions. You know, I had Lutheran religious instruction until I was 10, just because it was presented in the school I went to. And then later on, I went to Jewish classes. I've become more Jewish. I would never. Until Hitler came, it didn't even occur to me you have to make a point of it. But after Hitler came, I would never deny it. In fact, my father was always afraid that at some gatherings, I didn't look Jewish, that if I would see any kind of injustice, I would jump up and say something. I always had a big mouth, like he said. So I've taught my children never to deny. They are not very much practicing. In fact, they married to Gentiles, but they would never deny their Jewish origin and never make any kind of, bones about it. So it has strengthened. They would never give it up, and I would never give it up. And it doesn't really matter whether you're religious or not, but I wouldn't give it up. And nobody was, that's what Hitler has done. I mean, nobody can force you or me to give up your faith just because somebody else says you should. So.
You've been most eloquent. And we want to thank you for being with us this morning.
Well,
do you have anything that you would like to say in summary?
Well, I've been very lucky. Very, very lucky. That's the way I feel. That's why I thought I didn't qualify for this testimony, because I've been so lucky that I did not go through anything what I consider real bad.
I think you do qualify, and we're lucky that you were willing to come in and spend this time today.
Oh, I thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
My children are going to treasure this tape. I know that. So thank you very much.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks.